bite into an ear of sweet corn. No one could explain how a human being, armed with only stone tools and stubborn patience, turned one into the other. Those neat yellow rows, that burst of sugar, that satisfying crunch. Now picture the opposite. A scraggly wild grass, waist-high, sprouting a handful of seeds so hard they would crack a tooth. Those two plants are the same species. One is the direct ancestor of the other, and for decades, some of the sharpest botanists alive flatly refuse to believe it, because the wild plant looks nothing, like the corn on your plate. It took modern genetics to prove the transformation had even happened. And when the proof finally came, it was stranger than anyone had guessed. Here's the thing we tend to get wrong about farming. We picture our ancestors wandering the hills, spotting a tasty plant, and simply deciding to grow more of it. Find the wheat, plant the wheat, done. But that is not how any of this worked, because the wild versions of our crops did not want to be farmed. Wild wheat shatters the instant it ripens. It flings its seeds to the ground and scatters them. So the moment you touch the stalk, your harvest is already gone. The wild ancestor of corn wraps each of its few seeds in a shell, as hard as a pebble. These plants were not gifts waiting to be gathered. They were problems. And the people who slowly solved those problems were running the longest, quietest experiment in human history, without ever knowing they were running it. To find the true beginning, you have to travel much deeper in time than the textbooks used to allow. Go to the shore of the Sea of Galilee, in what is now northern Israel, to a drowned campsite called Ohallo II. It is around 23,000 years old, more than twice the age of farming itself. In 1989, the lake level dropped during a drought and exposed it, and the archaeobotanist Ehud Weiss, working with colleagues from Bar Ilan University, found something astonishing preserved in the waterlogged mud. The floors of brush huts, a hearth, a human grave, and the remains of more than 140 different plant species. On a grinding stone, they found the starch of wild wheat and barley, smeared there by someone making flour. Nearby lay flint blades still carrying the glossy sheen that comes only from slicing cereal stalks, and tens of thousands of charred seeds. And scattered through the camp were the seeds of what they called proto-weeds, the exact kinds of weeds that only flourish where humans disturb the soil. In a 2015 paper in the journal PLOS ONE, Weiss and his team argued this was trial cultivation. People were already tending small plots of wild grain, some 11,000 years before anyone would call it agriculture. Nobody at Ohallo set out to invent farming. They were simply, tentatively, beginning. Now jump forward to roughly 11,500 years ago, to the arc of fertile land curving through modern Syria, Iraq, Turkey, and the Levant. This is where the experiment finally locked in. Here, early farming communities assembled a kind of starter pack that archaeologists call the 8 founder crops: emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, barley, lentils, peas, chickpeas, bitter vetch, and flax. It is a beautifully balanced kit. Cereals for calories, legumes for protein that also quietly fertilize the soil, and flax for fiber and oil. Get all 8 going together and you can feed a village through the whole year. And it did not happen overnight. The archaeological record shows domestication was a slow grind that took perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 years to complete. But almost every loaf of bread, every bowl of lentil soup, and every linen shirt in the entire ancient world traces back to this one handful of species and this narrow band of land. Within a few thousand years, those same 8 plants had walked with farmers across Europe, into North Africa, and east toward the Indus, the seeds of an entire agricultural world. But here's where the story delivers its first real surprise. The first plant these people may have truly tamed wasn't a grain at all. It was a fig. At a site called Gilgal the First, in the Jordan Valley, the archaeologist Mordechai Kislev and his colleagues uncovered 9 small figs, carbonized and preserved, dating to about 11,400 years ago. In their 2006 paper in Science, they made a bold claim. These were a special seedless kind of fig that cannot reproduce on its own. In the wild, such a tree is an evolutionary dead end. It dies leaving no offspring. The only way its line survives across the centuries is if a human keeps snapping off its living branches and replanting them. If Kislev is right, someone was deliberately propagating fig trees a full 1,000 years before the cereals were tamed. It is contested. Other researchers, led by Simcha Lev Yadun, replied in Science that same year, pointing out that seedless figs can appear naturally, so a few sweet figs in a house do not prove an orchard. But it's a tantalizing hint that our very first act of plant breeding may have been reaching for something sweet. And this is the part almost nobody stops to appreciate. The real revolution was not any single plant. It was an invisible change happening inside the plants. Remember how wild wheat shatters and scatters its seed the moment it's ripe? Every so often, a random mutant is born that doesn't shatter, a plant that stubbornly holds onto its seeds instead of dropping them. In the wild, that mutant is doomed because it cannot spread itself. But the instant humans start harvesting with sickles, the entire logic flips. The plants that scatter their seed vanish into the dirt before you can cut them. The freak plants that cling to their seed are the ones you carry home, and the ones whose seed you accidentally sow again next spring. Do that for a few centuries and the mutant quietly takes over your whole field. Scientists call this whole bundle of changes the domestication syndrome. Tougher stalks, plumper seeds, and above all the loss of shattering. Nobody bred for it deliberately. That's not farming. That's evolution, with a human hand resting on the wheel. Once you know to look for that one fingerprint, the switch from shattering to non-shattering, you can watch domestication unfold in the archaeological record on the far side of the world. Travel to the lower Yangtze River in China, to a waterlogged site called Huxi, dated between 9,000 and 8,400 years ago. There, the researchers Yunfei Zheng and Gary Crawford, publishing in Scientific Reports in 2016, sorted through the tiny bases of ancient rice grains and found all three forms jumbled together: wild shattering rice, an intermediate form, and domesticated non-shattering rice. They had caught rice in the very act of being tamed, a crop suspended halfway between wild and farmed, frozen in the mud of a Neolithic ditch. Rice, which today feeds more than half the people alive, was still making up its mind 9,000 years ago. Which finally brings us back to the corn. Around 8,700 years ago, in the central Balsas River Valley of tropical southwestern Mexico, people were grinding something on their stone tools. At a rock shelter called Xihuatoxtla, the archaeobotanist Dolores Piperno and her colleagues scraped microscopic residues off those tools, starch grains and hard little plant crystals called phytoliths, and published their findings in the journal PNAS in 2009. The residues were maize, domesticated corn, already, nearly 9,000 years ago, in the exact region where its wild ancestor still grows wild today. And that ancestor is the strangest character in this entire story. It's a grass called teosinte, and it is almost comically unlike corn. It throws up many spindly stalks, and instead of a fat cob, it makes a tiny spike of maybe a dozen seeds, each one sealed inside that rock-hard case. If you stumbled across it by a roadside, you would never in 1,000 years guess it had anything to do with your dinner. So how on earth do you get from that armored weed to a golden cob? This is where it stops being gardening and becomes something else entirely. Back in the 20th century, the geneticist George Beadle floated the heretical idea that corn simply was teosinte, remodeled, and later John Dobley, at the University of Wisconsin, proved it. Dobley showed that a startlingly small number of genes, as few as 5 key regions, account for most of the enormous visible gulf between teosinte and corn. In 2015, in the journal Genetics, his team pinned down one of them, a gene called TGA1, a single change to a single letter of DNA, swapping one amino acid in one protein, is what strips away that stony case and leaves the kernel naked and edible. One mutation, and the armor falls off. It's the same plant, wearing a completely different body. Ancient farmers, of course, couldn't see genes. But by choosing the softest, fattest, most exposed kernels to replant, season after season for thousands of years, they were reaching straight into the plant's DNA and rewriting it, one seed at a time. And here is the twist that reframes the whole story. We did not merely find these plants and gather them. We physically rebuilt them, from the inside out, into organisms that had never existed before, and that mostly cannot survive without us. Modern corn can't even reproduce on its own anymore. Its kernels are packed tight inside a husk, and if a human doesn't peel and scatter them, they simply rot in a clump. We are its only route to a future, and the writer Michael Pollan, in his book The Botany of Desire, turned the obvious question upside down. We assume we domesticated the plants, But look at it from the plant's point of view. Wheat, rice, and corn quietly tricked a clever, restless ape into clearing away their competitors, watering them, guarding them, and carrying them to every continent on the planet. Today, those three grasses blanket more of the Earth's surface than any wild plant ever managed. So who, exactly, domesticated whom? We like to say we conquered the grasses. It is just as true to say the grasses conquered us. They turned us into their full-time gardeners, and we have been on our knees in their fields ever since. And that bargain didn't end in the Stone Age. We are still living inside it. When scientists today pick up gene editing tools and precisely tweak a crop in a single season, they are doing consciously, in a laboratory, exactly what Neolithic farmers did blindly with their hands over 10,000 years. Modern corn is now the largest grain crop on Earth, well over 1 billion tons a year, feeding livestock in cities and even fuel tanks. The experiment that began in a patch of wild grass beside the Sea of Galilee has simply, dramatically, sped up. So let's retrace the whole journey. 23,000 years ago, people were already tending wild grain on the shore of a lake in Galilee. By 11,500 years ago, 8 founder crops anchored the first true farms in the Fertile Crescent. Around the same moment, someone in the Jordan Valley may have been replanting fig branches purely for their sweetness. Then the silent revolution spread, the loss of shattering that turned wild grasses obedient. And you can watch it play out in the half-tamed rice of the Yangtze 9,000 years ago, and see its ultimate masterpiece in the corn of Mexico, a stony little weed re-engineered, seed by seed, into the plant that now feeds the world. So look at the food sitting in front of you right now. The corn, the rice, the bread, the lentils. None of it is truly natural. Every single bite is a living artifact, a piece of biological technology, designed across hundreds of human lifetimes by people who never once saw the finished product, and who could not possibly have imagined that their patient tinkering with a handful of weeds would one day feed 8 billion of us. You are eating the oldest invention our species ever made, and unlike almost every other ancient invention, this one is still alive, still growing, still being rewritten in fields all over the world. All the research is linked in the description.